Context we're diving into today, it requires us to look at the modern world maybe not just as a political landscape, but more as a set of really deeply entrenched, self-regulating cybernetic control systems. We're talking about things like the self-referential governmental Ouroboros, the bureaucracy that just consumes itself, and the automated economic leviathan, this sort of global, largely unregulated finance machine. And both these systems fundamentally seem to be steered by what's called the Grunch of Giants, which, well, we understand it as this structure defined by institutionalized, almost absolute selfishness and, crucially, inertia.
Right, and standing against this huge systemic rigidity is this, fascinating cognitive force, the time bender, often, as you said, identified with the ADHD temperament. This kind of mind operates in a kinetic, a nonlinear dimension of time and focus. It fundamentally rejects routine, prioritizes urgency, novelty. It's almost like an anarchy of the mind, as the source puts it.
Exactly, and our core question really springs from this clash. Given the overwhelming complexity and the sheer inertia of the modern system, is the chaotic kinetic flow that's inherent to this time-bender temperament, is it the necessary disruptive force for, let's say, evolutionary societal transformation? Is this the essential adaptive lever we actually need to break the system's rigidity?
Or maybe looking at it the other way. Is this temperament just fundamentally incompatible with generating the kind of sustained, orderly effort, the linear patience that you absolutely need to build the alternative? This living bejeweled revolution, the new stable systems humanity requires. I'll be arguing the latter, essentially maintaining that this chaotic flow, it just can't create stable structure in the long run.
And I'll be arguing that this mind's capacity for what Ashby called requisite variety is actually the essential biological tool to dismantle the system's current, lethal inertia, as our source terms it. So let's maybe elaborate on this inertia a bit. The Grunch, the Ouroboros, the Leviathan, they suffer from this paralyzing structural rigidity. And it's not just simple bureaucracy. It's an institutionalized slowness. It's driven by really outdated premises and just massive, overwhelming complexity. They thrive in a way precisely because their mechanisms of oppression, all the rules, the endless paperwork, the regulations, are, as the source says, too supra and infravisibly large to be sensitively comprehended by the average person, or frankly, even the average leader within the system.
The system is sort of designed to run on these conditioned reflexes, right? Low variety, ignorance, that makes it predictable, and therefore controllable by those who understand it.
Which is exactly why the time bender might be the necessary adaptive lever. This kinetic mind is, it's structurally opposed to this rigidity. It's driven by this almost insatiable hunger for novelty, challenge, and urgency. And if we look at the principle from cybernetics, Ashby's law, that to regulate a complex evolving system, the regulator must possess at least as much complexity, the time bender's kinetic flow offers exactly that necessary variety. Their capacity for, rapid pivoting, for actually thriving in chaos, it provides the neurobiological complexity needed to counteract the system's simple, often paralyzed reflexes, and potentially catalyze the metasystem transitions needed for a radical shift towards livandry, which is defined as comprehensive economic success for all humanity, achieved through technological efficiency.
Okay. I see why you emphasize variety and complexity. But let's consider maybe the crash landing that this kinetic flow can often lead to. We agree, I think, that the goal is living Terry, right? Which demands the integration of all these specialized technological advances to achieve synergetic significance. And that requires, precision and persistence.
And you believe the time bender fundamentally lacks those two elements?
Fundamentally, yes, I think so. The temperament seems wired to be completely in the right now. It rejects routine because anything that gets categorized as boring or non-urgent becomes biologically incredibly hard to initiate action on. This is their kryptonite, It doesn't matter how important they know the task is. This nonlinear time perception, it conflicts
directly with the slow, linear gestational lags that are just inherent in massive technological projects. These can sometimes span decades, 50, 75 years even. The only way the time bender reliably achieves peak efficiency is through that lever of urgency, which almost by definition leads to structural instability. Building a new organized society requires disciplined self-mastery over long stretches of time, not a chaotic dependency on the adrenaline buzz of the latest crisis. And just expanding on that a little. I really have to question the sustainability of motivation when it's driven almost exclusively by interest and urgency. How can time be, quote, biologically bent by these individuals? They seem to genuinely operate with this optimism that they can just teleport from one task to another without any preparation time. That's a fundamental rejection of linear planning. And moreover, they often show this distinct aversion to prematurity, resisting being before time, which means they often wait until the absolute last possible second. You just cannot build stable, integrated systems which demand long periods of non-urgent routine when the foundation of the labor itself is predicated on needing an adrenaline rush to get going.
I see why you frame it as maybe a reliance on adrenaline, but I would frame it differently. I'd see it more as a neurobiological activation mechanism. The ability to bend time is precisely because the brain isn't easily jump-started by simple importance or routine tasks. That do-or-die, urgent right-now deadline, it forces the necessary high-pressure state needed to fully engage the prefrontal cortex, and that pressure, that's what unlocks the hyper-efficiency, the intense focused creativity we sometimes see.
But you seem to be celebrating the high-quality output of that creative burst, like the brilliant paper written overnight. But you're kind of ignoring the preceding period of often catastrophic procrastination and the resulting systemic instability that creates for partners, for colleagues, for systems, relying on that output before the deadline hits.
I focus on the output because that novelty, that ability to find those hidden connections, to distill knowledge rapidly from just overwhelming amounts of data, that's the currency needed to counteract the current gridlock. The existing system, often staffed by, let's say, more neurotypical leaders, it gets paralyzed by information overload and these slow gestation periods. The kinetic mind's ability to function as a local universe problem solver, cutting through the noise in that critical moment, that makes the nonlinear process potentially worth the volatility. They seem uniquely adapted, perhaps, to handle the kind of simultaneous overlapping crises that define modern evolutionary change.
Maybe we can pivot slightly to the mechanism of oppression itself.
The grunge, it maintains its power largely by monopolizing what our source calls invisible know-how technology. Think proprietary chemistry, advanced metallurgy, cybernetic management tools.
So the solution to that kind of structural oppression, therefore, might be progressive ephemeralization, essentially doing more with less, rapidly accelerating technological advancement just becomes irrelevant. And the time-bender's capacity for intense imagination, for finding those hidden, non-obvious connections in huge data sets, that's exactly the capability required, arguably, to break the grunch's technological lock.
I'm sorry, but I just don't quite buy that the technical solution is the primary weapon here. The grunge sustains its power just as effectively, maybe even more so through legal contrivances, specifically things like limited liability, which shields the core actors from consequence, and through sheer economic deception. Our source material is actually very clear on this point. The key deception is unilateral price advancing, which it basically defines as the hidden mechanism of inflation that legally effectively robs non-shareholders.
You're focusing on the theft aspect, fair enough, but the solution is still fundamentally structural, isn't it?
It is structural, yes, but tackling it requires decoding the battle of the codes, as the source puts it. Power versus non-power, payment versus non-payment. And that means sustained organizational and political engagement, exposing the legal tricks, the financial sleight of hand, and that kind of long-term, often tedious, bureaucratic routine is precisely what the time-bender temperament instinctively rejects. They might prefer, chaotic consumption loops online that offer instant dopamine hits, rather than sitting through long, boring organizing meetings. Which brings us directly to the system's own cybernetic control mechanisms. The economic leviathan, particularly through surveillance capitalism and algorithmic control. It uses this engine of engineered addiction. It traps the user in a high-stimulus loop that is fundamentally profitable for the Grunch. And the central paradox here, which is fascinating, is this functional regression we see in media. The source calls it the phenomenon that TV ate social media.
Okay. Explain that regression a bit more, because obviously the technology looks different.
Right, it looks different, but think about it. Historically, broadcast television was pure passive consumption. You just sat there. Social media initially promised genuine engagement, interaction, infinite variety, a chaotic, user-driven space. But the system, optimized relentlessly for profit, quickly figured out how to revert social media back into a kind of hyper-stimulus, essentially passive consumption model. It's engineered for emotional instability and constant, predictable dopamine hits, just like channel surfing, but algorithmically perfected. And this high-stimulus digital chaos acts as a profoundly maladaptive adaptation specifically for the time-bender mind. It perfectly fulfills their neurological need for urgency and novelty, but it channels all that energy toward passive consumption, working against the desired outcome of self-mastery and actual system disruption. The cybernetic system is effectively using their neurological difference as a highly profitable control mechanism.
That's a compelling argument regarding exploitation, definitely. But I would still frame the central failure of the Leviathan slightly differently. Its weakness isn't just addiction, it's also gridlock. The sheer volume of data, the complexity of regulation, the overlapping crises, a pandemic, rapid climate change, economic instability all hitting at once, this causes paralyzing indecisiveness among more neurotypical leadership structures. They seem to require linear flow, and the chaos just shuts them down.
So the chaotic mind becomes the counterweapon in that scenario.
Exactly. The kinetic mind, the one that thrives in chaos and can pivot rapidly, might be uniquely equipped to handle these complex, non-simultaneous, overlapping episodes of evolutionary change. Where the neurotypical person might get bogged down, controlled by the flow of paper and established procedure, the time-bender's innate need for novelty provides a kind of necessary spontaneous resistance. Their internal chaos, in a way, provides the requisite variety needed to cut through the bureaucratic red tape and act decisively when the more linear minds are paralyzed. And finally, we probably need to address the issue of highly competent but, let's say, deeply self-interested actors, what some might even call those with darker elements or tendencies. Since the Grunch itself is driven by this institutionalized, absolute selfishness, described as a soulless non-human corporation, we probably can't rely on simple moral conversion to fix things.
So I would argue the only way to truly reorient the system is through superior, undeniable efficiency. Computational integration, perhaps, will eventually demonstrate that comprehensive economic success for all humanity, the concept of living-re, is actually the most profitable path available, full stop.
You really believe pure calculation, pure efficiency will save us?
In this context, perhaps yes. If the system can be redesigned to be so efficient that even deeply self-interested actors, including maybe those with dark triad tendencies, can only realize their maximum personal competence and gain by aligning their efforts toward universal success, well, they might just do so out of pure self-calculation. The kinetic mind's typical focus on competence and efficacy, often regardless of social routine, could be what drives this kind of disruptive efficiency forward.
I remain unconvinced by that particular line of reasoning, primarily because relying solely on the self-interested drive of high-competence individuals risks accelerating a kind of totalizing outcome. The convergence we're seeing between the Ouroboros and the Leviathan, it signals a severe peril, the emergence of a new, hybrid system, what the material calls a governance market complex. High self-interest channeled through increasingly sophisticated cybernetic tools might not decentralize success at all. It might simply accelerate this convergence towards a singular all-encompassing machine, realizing total cybernetic control rather than broad, decentralized human success. The chaos of the time-bender, in this view, could tragically just be the necessary catalyst for the emergence of the ultimate, highly efficient control system, not liberation.
So our disagreement seems to lie in the fundamental utility of that kinetic energy. I'd maintain that the temperament's capacity for novelty, urgency, and variety provides the necessary kinetic charge, if you will, to engage with and ultimately dismantle the rigid, slow-moving structures of oppression, those systems that arguably lead towards human extinction by political folly and inaction. It's potentially a biological tool for evolutionary transformation precisely because it provides the speed and complexity required to manage concurrent, overwhelming crises.
And I would maintain that the inherent opposition to long-term routine, combined with that deep reliance on immediate urgency, makes this temperament structurally ill-suited to actually build the stable, organized, new living systems required to replace the old ones. This very kinetic flow, as we discuss, seems dangerously vulnerable to exploitation by the engineered addiction of the hyper-stimulus digital control systems, ultimately turning that potentially useful variety into a kind of chaos that's profitable only to the grunch.
Well, the tension itself between structure and kinetic variety is perhaps, as our source suggests, one of the most important drivers for any kind of evolutionary progression. It reflects that continuous dance between the generation of variety and the necessary imposition of constraint.
Indeed. And the material definitely offers some profound insights, I think, into the kind of minds that might be best equipped to solve what it calls humanity's cosmic purpose as local universe problem solvers. The critical path ahead, it seems, remains defined by how we manage this inevitable clash between systemic control and the perhaps necessary anarchy of the creative, kinetic mind.